The Hindu Kush Mountains sprawled beneath Captain James Holloway like the scarred backbone of a sleeping giant. From 22,000 feet, the terrain was both beautiful and brutal. Sharp ridges painted in shades of gray and brown, valleys so deep they appeared black, ravines that seemed to swallow light itself. Holloway had flown this route 247 times. He knew every peak, every suspected enemy position, every weather pattern that could turn a routine patrol into a death sentence. Today, something felt different. It was the kind of feeling that had kept him alive for 17 years in the cockpit. His commanders called it instinct. His fellow pilots called it luck. Holloway knew better. It was pattern recognition honed to a razor's edge, the accumulated wisdom of thousands of hours watching the sky, reading wind, understanding his enemy. The radio chatter that morning had been light, almost mundane. Supply runs, patrol updates, routine maintenance issues at forward operating bases. But Holloway's survival instinct had been quietly vibrating all day, like a tuning fork struck in the dark. His wingman, Captain Marcus Viper Chen, flew 2 kilometers to his starboard side, their A-10 Warthogs cutting through the thin air with the lumbering grace of armored bulls. These weren't graceful fighter jets. A-10s were built like tanks with wings, thick titanium armor plating around the cockpit, a rotary cannon that could tear through a building, and enough hardpoints to carry an arsenal that would make a small nation envious. Pilots joked that if you wanted speed and elegance, you flew something else. If you wanted to deliver hell itself and come home alive, you flew a Warthog. Holloway loved his aircraft the way some men love their wives. The A-10 didn't judge you. It didn't ask if you were scared or uncertain. It simply did what you asked, reliably, brutally, perfectly. Unlike the sleeker jets that dominated the headlines, the A-10 was unpretentious. It was the blue-collar hero of the sky, loud, powerful, and absolutely dedicated to one mission: keeping American soldiers alive on the ground. Slate 12, we're approaching waypoint Lima. Chen's voice crackled through the communication system. Weather looking good on the eastern valley. Copy that, Viper, Holloway responded, his eyes scanning the instrument panel with the kind of attention most people reserved for newborn bobbies. Everything was nominal. Engines running hot and strong, fuel reserves adequate, weapons systems armed and ready. The GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon mounted in his nose was loaded with 1,174 rounds of 30mm depleted uranium ammunition. Those rounds could penetrate armor from miles away. In the hands of a skilled pilot, they were the difference between a ground unit going home and becoming names on a memorial wall. Holloway's call sign Ghost had originated from an incident 3 years ago when his A-10 took a rocket-propelled grenade hit that should have been catastrophic. The RPG had torn through his fuselage, destroyed his hydraulic systems, damaged his landing gear, and shredded his left wing. Any other pilot would have ejected. Instead, Holloway had coaxed his dying aircraft across 50 kilometers of hostile territory and landed it, not crashed, on a forward operating base runway. When he climbed out of the cockpit, covered in hydraulic fluid and smoke residue, the ground crew had stood in stunned silence. One sergeant had whispered, "He's like a ghost. You can't kill him." The name stuck. But Holloway knew the truth. It wasn't that he couldn't be killed. It was that he understood the stakes deeply enough to never take unnecessary risks. Every decision in the cockpit was calculated. Every maneuver was purposeful. Every second counted because real people on the ground, soldiers with families, with hopes, with futures, depended on the decisions he made at 22,000 feet. The radio had been quiet for exactly 42 minutes. Holloway knew because he always tracked conversation gaps. Quiet meant either good news or no news yet. Both were preferable to the chaos that usually accompanied combat situations. He was mentally running through his fuel calculations, estimating how much longer they could maintain patrol when the radio came alive. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Shadow 6, we're hit, going down." The words hit Holloway like a physical blow. His breath caught. His hands automatically gripped the control stick tighter. Shadow 6 was Major Robert Castellano's call sign, Bobby Castellano. They'd gone through advanced training together at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona. Holloway could still remember Castellano's laugh, this big, booming sound that filled a room and made everyone around him smile. They'd flown together on joint exercises, drunk coffee in the pilot's lounge, complained about the military bureaucracy that kept them bound in regulations and paperwork. Bobby had a wife named Sarah and a daughter. What was her name? Emma. Yes, Emma, who was 7 years old. Last month at the officers' club, Bobby had shown everyone pictures from Emma's school play. She'd played a tree. Bobby had been so proud he'd nearly burst. Shadow 6, this is Slate 12. I have you on radar, Holloway transmitted, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. What's your position? How many souls on board? Through the thick clouds ahead, orange fire bloomed against the mountainside. The fireball rose like a dying star, mushrooming into the gray sky. Holloway's eyes locked on it. That wasn't a controlled descent. That was a crash. Shadow 6, respond, Holloway called again, his experienced ear catching the desperation creeping into his own voice. He forced it down. Fear was a luxury pilots couldn't afford. Shadow 6, come in. Slate 12, we're tracking Shadow 6 on radar, a calmer voice cut through from command. Last radar contact suggests impact approximately 3 kilometers northwest of your current position. Prepare for search and rescue coordination. Prepare. As if this was a routine procedure, something you checked off a list. As if a man Holloway had shared lunch with wasn't burning in a twisted cockpit somewhere on that mountainside. As if Emma Castellano wasn't about to lose her father. Holloway banked hard left, his responding to the control inputs like an extension of his own body. His eyes searched the clouds, looking for any sign of the downed aircraft. The weather was deteriorating. He could feel it in the way the air currents were shifting, in the darkening cloud formations to the northwest. A storm was coming, one of those violent mountain storms that could ground entire squadrons. Viper, do you have anything? Holloway asked his wingman. Negative, Ghost. Nothing on radar except the impact site. No emergency beacon yet. No beacon meant the communications equipment was damaged or destroyed. It meant Shadow 6 was out there, in that crash site, possibly injured, definitely isolated, with no way to signal for help until someone could get close enough to spot them visually. Holloway's mind raced through protocols and procedures. Search and rescue would need to launch a helicopter. That would take time, precious time. Pararescue teams would need to be briefed, equipped, loaded onto a Black Hawk. Weather clearance would need to be obtained. Command would need to assemble a recovery plan. All of that added up to minutes turning into hours, hours turning into a situation where a wounded pilot could bleed out in the cold Afghan mountains. This is Slate 12 requesting vector to last known position of Shadow 6, Holloway transmitted. I'm going to establish eyes on with the crash site. Request immediate SAR launch. Holloway's thumb hovered over his weapons controls. If Bobby was alive down there, they were going to need close air support. They were going to need someone in the sky who wouldn't leave, who wouldn't quit, who would stay until the job was done or he ran out of fuel. Holloway had made that promise the day he got his wings. He made it every single time he strapped into the cockpit. The A-10 screamed toward the impact site as the mountains below seemed to reach up like hungry hands. The Black Hawk helicopter thundered through the mountain pass like a mechanical beast, rotors beating the thin air into submission. Inside the cargo bay, 8 pararescuemen checked their gear one final time, with the ritualistic precision of men who understood that forgotten details killed people. Master Sergeant Daniel Dutch, Morrison sat closest to the open door, his boots dangling over the rushing landscape below. At 42 years old, Morrison was the oldest PJ in the unit, a veteran of 37 combat rescue operations. He'd pulled dying men from burning helicopters, carried wounded soldiers across minefields, and held pressure on wounds while taking fire from 3 directions. but every insertion still carried that electric charge of uncertainty. That moment when you left the relative safety of the aircraft and committed to whatever hell waited on the ground. Morrison's team consisted of 7 other specialists: Combat Medic Lieutenant Jake Torres, Weapons Sergeant Carl Big Dog Washington, Technical Sergeant Michael Freight Train Novak, Senior Airman David Doc Yamamoto, Staff Sergeant Kevin Pierce, Airman First Class Brandon Kid Reynolds, and the team's newest member, Airman Tyler Rookie Matthews, who was on his 5th combat insertion. Each man had trained together for months, run thousands of drills, rehearsed scenarios until their responses became automatic. But no amount of training could truly prepare you for the moment when real bullets started coming. The helicopter crew chief, a wiry man named Sullivan with a Boston accent thick enough to cut with a knife, suddenly thrust his head toward the intercom. 2 minutes out, he shouted over the rotor noise. The pilot, Captain Sarah Hammer Hendricks, acknowledged from the cockpit. Hammer had logged more combat hours in the Black Hawk than anyone in the unit. She flew like she had nothing to lose, but everyone knew better. She had 2 kids at home, a husband who worried every single time she left the house, and dreams of eventually commanding her own aviation unit. But when she was in the cockpit, all of that faded. There was only the mission. Morrison made eye contact with each of his men. This was the moment, the threshold between possibility and action. He nodded once, slowly, deliberately. Each man nodded back. The communication was wordless but complete. Whatever happened in the next 30 minutes, they would face it together. They would bring Bobby Castellano home alive, or they would die trying. Those were the only acceptable outcomes. Holloway's A-10 screamed past them at 350 miles per hour, banking hard right toward a ridge where Morrison's satellite imagery had identified 3 enemy positions. The A-10 was both beautiful and terrifying, a flying fortress with enough firepower to level a city block. Morrison watched it disappear beyond the ridge and heard, moments later, the unmistakable sound of the GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon firing. The noise was unlike anything else on a battlefield, a sound that made your teeth ache and your bones vibrate. It was the sound of pure destructive force unleashed. The ground erupted. Morrison saw the impacts from his vantage point, saw the enemy positions light up with explosions and secondary detonations. Holloway had targeted what appeared to be an ammunition cache. Excellent. The enemy would be ducking for cover, their heads down, their attention on survival rather than on the incoming helicopter. 60 seconds, the crew chief bellowed. Sullivan was already repositioning the door guns, twin M240 machine guns that could put down suppressing fire if needed. The kid beside him, Airman Reynolds, was already cycling through his mental checklist. 200 rounds per gun. Target priority, Northeast Ridge. Protect the Black Hawk at all costs. The insertion zone was a relatively flat area of rocky terrain about 200 meters from the crash site. The downed fighter jet wouldn't be visible from the LZ, but Morrison had GPS coordinates precise to within a meter. His 2 navigators, Yamamoto and Pierce, had already loaded the exact coordinates into their handheld devices. The plan was simple. Insert on the LZ, establish a security perimeter, move to the crash site on foot, locate Major Castellano, provide emergency medical treatment, and extract back to the Black Hawk. Total time on the ground, 12 minutes maximum. In theory. The Black Hawk descended rapidly, and Morrison felt his stomach lurch in that familiar way. The altimeter in his mind was counting down. Altitude dropping. Enemy fire now possible. Rounds could reach them from any of the high ground surrounding the LZ. Holloway's cannon fire had been accurate and devastating, but no air support could suppress every enemy position. There was always someone somewhere with a rifle and the will to use it. Taking fire, Northeast Ridge, Reynolds shouted from the starboard gun, and suddenly the world became pure chaos. Morrison felt the impacts, tangible thuds as rounds punctured the Black Hawk's fuselage. Not armor-piercing ammunition, thank God. Standard rifle fire couldn't penetrate the aircraft's belly plating, but it was disconcerting nonetheless. It meant the enemy was alive, alert, and ready to fight. Holloway's A-10 responded with immediate fury. The cannon fire started again, and Morrison saw the northeast ridge erupt like a volcano. Enemy muzzle flashes disappeared. Holloway was magnificent. He was reading the battlefield in real time, adapting, responding, using his devastating firepower like a surgeon wielding a scalpel. The A-10 pilot wasn't trying to kill everything. He was trying to suppress the specific threats that endangered the Black Hawk and the rescue team. 30 seconds. Sullivan's voice was rock-steady, despite the violence surrounding them. The crew chief had been shot down twice before and lived. He understood that panic was contagious. Leadership meant staying calm when everything around you was screaming for panic. Morrison's hand moved to the rope. 7 other hands gripped similar ropes. The moment the Black Hawk touched down or got close enough to the ground, they would move out simultaneously. 8 pararescuemen wouldn't stay on the ground any longer than they had to. The longer they were exposed, the more time the enemy had to call in reinforcements, adjust fire, bring more forces to bear. The Black Hawk slowed, descended, and Morrison's boots suddenly touched earth. The sensation was electric, ground contact. He was committed now. Behind him, the other 7 moved in perfect synchronization, deploying from the aircraft like seeds from a split pod. Morrison sprinted left, establishing the northern security position. Washington moved right, covering the southern approach. Torres and Yamamoto set up center, providing mutual support. Pierce, Novick, Reynolds, and Matthews formed a secondary perimeter. They'd been on the ground for 8 seconds when the first coordinated volley of enemy fire came from the west. Morrison heard the familiar crack-crack-crack of assault rifles, then the heavier thuds of machine gun fire. He immediately returned fire, his M4 barking in short, controlled bursts. Washington engaged from his position. Reynolds opened up with his designated marksman rifle. Holloway's A-10 was already moving. The aircraft had been making a banking turn, preparing for another pass when the enemy fire commenced. Holloway didn't hesitate. He accelerated toward the new threat, his cannon already spinning up. The western ridge lit up with explosions. Enemy fire from that direction ceased almost immediately, though not before one round hit their medical specialist, Doc Yamamoto, in the shoulder. Yamamoto went down. Torres was there instantly, but there was no time for proper wound treatment. He applied a quick pressure bandage and helped Yamamoto to his feet. The injury was painful but not immediately life-threatening. Yamamoto could fight. That's all that mattered right now. "We're hot," Morrison transmitted. "One friendly wounded but mobile, proceeding to target location, provide cover fire." "Copy that, Morrison." Holloway's calm voice came through the radio. "I'm establishing a patrol pattern. Any fire from the ridges, I'll have it suppressed. You focus on the ground. I'll own the sky." It was exactly what Morrison needed to hear. Holloway was committed, flying low and fast, positioning himself to respond to threats instantly. This was the beauty of close air support, a skilled pilot and a skilled ground commander working in perfect synchronization. The 8 pararescuemen now spread into a tactical formation with Torres keeping pressure on Yamamoto's shoulder, advanced toward the crash site. The ground was brutal, sharp rocks, loose shale, ravines that appeared without warning, but they moved with purpose and speed. Somewhere in this mountain, a fighter pilot was waiting for rescue, and they would not fail him. Above them, Slate 12 circled like an armored guardian angel. The crash site lay in a ravine approximately 1.2 kilometers northeast of the insertion point. To Morrison, moving through this terrain at combat speed felt like running through a minefield blindfolded. Every step could be your last. The ground was treacherous, loose shale that would give way under your boots, sharp rocks that cut through tactical gear, sudden drops that could break an ankle or worse. But they moved anyway, because that's what pararescuemen did. They moved toward danger when every instinct screamed to move away from it. Morrison's radio crackled with Holloway's voice, calm and professional. I've got movement on the western slope, approximately 400 meters from your position. Looks like a squad of hostiles moving south toward you. Time to intercept, 8 minutes at their current pace. I'm engaging. The world exploded with sound. Even from 500 meters away, the A-10's cannon fire was audible, that distinctive roar that sounded like angry thunder tearing through the sky. Morrison didn't slow down to watch. He kept moving, trusting Holloway to do his job while he focused on his own. The ground beneath them trembled from the concussive blast of the cannon rounds impacting the slope. Contact suppressed, Holloway reported. Estimated 5 tangos eliminated, 2 to 3 in withdrawal. You've got maybe 7 minutes before they regroup or reinforcements arrive. Move it. Morrison increased the pace. His men understood without discussion what that meant. They shifted from tactical movement to assault pace, faster, more aggressive, accepting greater risk for speed. Yamamoto was struggling with his shoulder wound, but he kept up. That was the mark of a true soldier. You did your job even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. The ravine opened before them suddenly. One moment they were navigating rocky terrain. The next, the ground dropped away into a steep-sided canyon. And there, 100 meters below them, was the wreckage. The fighter jet had hit nose first, carving a scar of destruction down the ravine wall. Metal was scattered across 200 meters of terrain. The fuselage had broken in 3 pieces. The canopy was gone. One wing had been sheared completely off, another bent at an angle that defied physics. Fires still burned in several locations, small, hungry orange flames consuming aviation fuel and composite materials. For a moment, Morrison's heart sank. No one could survive that. The impact force alone would have been catastrophic, but his training kicked in, overriding the despair. Castellano had activated his emergency beacon. That meant he had been conscious enough to do so. That meant there was at least a possibility of life. Doc Yamamoto, you're with me, Morrison said. Everyone else establish a perimeter. Watch those slopes. Kid, I want you on the western ridge. Big Dog, eastern approach. Pierce and Novick watch the south. Matthews, maintain 360-degree awareness. The men moved into position without question, their weapons ready, their eyes scanning the surrounding terrain. Tor stayed with Yamamoto to monitor his shoulder, providing what pain management he could with the medical supplies in his pack. Doc Yamamoto, despite the injury, was mentally preparing for whatever they might find in that wreckage. Morrison and Yamamoto descended into the ravine, using the rock formations as cover and attempting to maintain some semblance of tactical awareness despite the urgency screaming through their veins. The heat from the burning wreckage intensified as they approached. Morrison could smell it, burning fuel, scorched metal, melted electronics, and something else. Something organic. Something that made his stomach clench. Shadow 6, this is Morrison, he transmitted, using Castellano's call sign. We're approaching your position. If you can hear this, remain in place and maintain radio silence unless you have tactical information. Nothing, no response. Morrison's jaw tightened. They reached the main fuselage wreckage, and Morrison's trained eye immediately began cataloging the damage. The cockpit section had inverted on impact. The canopy was obliterated. The ejection seat was still in place, which meant, his heart sank further, that Castellano hadn't ejected. Either the ejection systems had failed, or he'd been unconscious, or he'd chosen to ride it down hopping to save the aircraft. There, Yamamoto pointed. Morrison's eyes followed the gesture. Beneath a twisted section of the fuselage's side panel, a hand, a human hand still wearing a flight glove, still moving. Morrison moved faster than he'd moved in years. He threw off his heavy tactical pack and began working at the metal, using his tools and pure strength to bend and break the wreckage away. Yamamoto joined him, their hands working in frantic coordination. The metal was hot enough to burn through their gloves, but neither man hesitated. After 40 seconds that felt like 40 years, they had enough space. Morrison reached in and found a shoulder, An arm, a face covered in blood and soot. Major Robert Bobby Castellano. His eyes were barely open, consciousness hanging by a thread. "We've got him," Morrison transmitted, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. "He's alive. Multiple injuries. Commencing emergency medical assessment." "Copy that," Holloway's voice came back, tight but controlled. "You've got maybe 5 minutes before that Western group regroups, also picking up activity on the eastern slope. Looks like another squad moving toward your position. Recommend expedited extraction." Yamamoto was already moving, his wounded shoulder forgotten as his medic's training took over. He used scissors to cut away Castellano's flight suit, revealing the injuries beneath. Left leg was shattered, compound fracture with significant bleeding. Chest trauma consistent with impact injuries. Possible internal bleeding. Head wound that was bleeding heavily but appeared to be superficial. "Tourniquet," Yamamoto snapped. Morrison already had one out, applying it above Castellano's knee with brutal efficiency. The blood flow slowed. Yamamoto packed gauze into the open wound, applying pressure to control the hemorrhage. His movements were practiced, efficient, the product of hundreds of hours of training. "Shadow 6, I'm Major Morrison with Pararescue," he said, making eye contact with the barely conscious pilot. "You're injured but alive. We're going to get you out of here. I need you to stay conscious. Can you hear me?" Castellano's eyes focused slightly. A slight nod. Good. Consciousness was better than unconsciousness. The ground erupted with gunfire. Not the distant sound they'd heard before, but close. Immediate. Hostile fire from multiple positions opening up simultaneously. "Contact northeast and southeast," Pierce's voice crackled through the radio. "Multiple hostiles suppressing fire." Morrison's M4 was suddenly in his hands. He didn't remember picking it up, but his training had taken over completely. He returned fire toward the northeast position, laying down suppressing rounds while Yamamoto continued working on Castellano's injuries. Holloway's A-10 screamed overhead, so close Morrison could feel the heat from its engines. The cannon fire was deafening, apocalyptic in its intensity. The eastern slope erupted. Enemy positions disappeared under devastating firepower. "Get him ready to move," Morrison ordered. "We're not staying here." He bound Castellano's leg injuries as quickly as possible, using compression dressings to stabilize the fracture. Castellano gasped with pain but remained conscious. Morrison and Yamamoto, working together, fashioned a makeshift litter from their equipment and Castellano's own emergency kit. "All stations converge on Morrison's position," Morrison transmitted. "We're moving back to the Black Hawk, now." His men didn't hesitate. They broke their perimeter positions and moved toward the ravine in tactical bounds, one moving while the others provided covering fire, then switching. The enemy was still attempting to pin them down, but Holloway's A-10 was methodically destroying every position that opened fire. As Pierce and Novick reached the ravine, they immediately took over carrying Castellano's makeshift litter. Morrison took the point position, his weapon ready, his mind already calculating extraction vectors and remaining enemy threats. Above them, Holloway's cannon fire continued, keeping the enemy suppressed and off balance. "We're moving," Morrison transmitted to the A-10. "Be ready to cover our approach back to the Black Hawk." "I'm not going anywhere," Holloway replied. "Get him home, Morrison. I've got your 6. And in that moment, Morrison understood something fundamental about Captain James Holloway. The pilot wasn't just providing support. He was committed, absolutely, completely committed to ensuring this team succeeded, whatever it took, whatever the cost. They moved up the ravine slope, carrying the broken body of a man they'd come to save, with the sound of an armored angel's weapons thunder above them. Sergeant First Class Kyle Chen had been Holloway's weapons officer for 847 flight hours. They'd trained together, flown together, faced combat together. Chen knew Holloway's patterns, his rhythms, his tendencies. which is why Chen's sudden rigidity in the seat beside him sent a chill down Holloway's spine. "Sir," Chen's voice came through the intercom, tight and controlled but with an undertone of concern that Chen rarely allowed to surface. "New contact, coming up on radar, 2 o'clock position, range 40 kilometers. Low altitude heading appears to be converging on our current position." Holloway's eyes flickered to his radar scope. Sure enough, there it was, a new contact that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. Not a helicopter, not a transport. The signature was distinctive, unmistakable to anyone who'd studied enemy air defense systems. Mobile SAM launcher, surface-to-air missile system. "Confirm contact," Holloway said, his voice remaining level despite the surge of adrenaline flooding his system. "Confirmed. No active emissions yet, but sir," Chen leaned forward, his eyes fixed on his instruments. "Range is closing, 38 kilometers. They're moving fast, could be searching for us, could be responding to our engagement in the valley." Holloway's mind immediately ran through calculations. SAM systems of this type had an effective range of approximately 35 kilometers against a target as large as an A-10. They had maybe 3 minutes before the system came into effective range, 3 minutes before they became vulnerable, 3 minutes before his presence in the sky became a liability rather than an asset. "Keep me updated on range and vector," Holloway commanded, already running through tactical options in his head. The standard response would be to break engagement and climb. Get altitude, get distance, use the A-10's maneuverability and electronic countermeasures to evade. He could do that. He could preserve his aircraft and himself and still provide some level of support to Morrison's team from a safer distance. But Morrison's team was still in the ravine. The rescue helicopter was still en route. The enemy was still pressing from multiple directions. "Range 35 kilometers, Chen reported. "They're definitely on a convergence course with us. Sir, they're warming up the radar. I'm getting emissions. Active radar illumination. They're preparing to lock on." Holloway's eyes stayed fixed on the ground below. He could see Morrison's team moving through the ravine, carrying Castellano on the makeshift litter. They were making good time, but they were still a good 8 minutes from the extraction zone. 8 minutes. The rescue helicopter was 4 minutes out. If that SAM system got a lock on the Black Hawk while it was on approach to pick up the rescue team, the helicopter would have no chance. The standard defensive response was to brake hard, dump chaff and flares, attempt evasive maneuvers. But against a radar-guided missile launched from that range, in this terrain, with those wind patterns, the helicopter's survival probability was negligible. Holloway's jaw tightened. "Range 32 kilometers, Chen continued, his voice taking on a quality of urgency. "Sir, I'm detecting multiple launch systems. This isn't one vehicle. This is a coordinated SAM battery. Looks like they've got 3 separate launch units converging on this area. They're setting up a kill zone." 3 separate SAM systems. That changed the calculus significantly. 3 launch units meant redundancy. It meant that even if Holloway used his electronic countermeasures to defeat one system, the others would have him. 3 systems meant they weren't taking chances. This was a coordinated, sophisticated air defense network designed to bring down a high-value target. An A-10 provided consistent close air support. Eliminating the A-10 would improve the enemy's tactical position significantly. They were hunting him. "Range 28 kilometers, Chen reported. "We're approaching their effective engagement range. Sir, command is asking for our status." Holloway's hand moved to the radio with practiced precision. "This is Slate 12. We have multiple SAM systems converging on our position. Estimated 3 separate launch units. Currently tracking range at 28 kilometers and closing. Recommend immediate vector adjustment for Black Hawk. Suggest approach from the south, lower altitude profile to minimize radar cross-section." "Copy that, Slate 12, command's voice came back. "We're already directing Black Hawk on a southern approach vector. However, with multiple SAM systems setting up a battery, even southern approach carries significant risk. You need to break engagement and increase altitude for mutual support of the extraction. Break engagement, get distance, preserve himself. It all made perfect sense from a tactical standpoint. An A-10 that had been shot down was no value to anyone. Holloway understood the logic. He'd been taught the logic at every training facility, every warfare school, every command briefing. Self-preservation enabled the mission. If you got killed, you couldn't help anyone. But range 25 kilometers, Chen said. His voice had taken on a desperate quality now. Sir, they're moving into position for lock-on. We need to execute evasive maneuvers immediately. Holloway looked down. Morrison's team was moving faster now, understanding the urgency. He could see Castellano's litter bouncing as they moved. Morrison was pushing his men to the absolute limit of their physical capacity. They were going to get the injured pilot to the extraction zone with maybe 4 minutes to spare. But if those SAM systems locked on to the Black Hawk while it was in the valley, while it was descended to pick up the rescue team, the helicopter would be sitting ducks. It would be slow, vulnerable, committed to the ground. The Black Hawk pilots would have no good options. Break off the extraction and gain altitude, leaving the rescue team behind. Commit to the pickup and accept the incoming missile strike. Neither option was acceptable. Range 23 kilometers, Chen reported. Active lock attempts beginning. They've got targeting radar fully illuminating our position. Holloway was quiet for a moment. In that moment, he ran through every tactical option, every strategic consideration, every training scenario he'd ever experienced. And underneath it all, running like a river of cold certainty, was a single fundamental truth. He'd made a promise to those men on the ground. He'd made that promise the moment he'd volunteered for this mission. He'd made it every time he'd lit off the engines on this aircraft. He'd made it the day he got his wings. No one gets left behind. Chen, Holloway said, his voice absolutely calm. I want you to relay this to command. Tell them we're maintaining station. We're not breaking engagement. We're staying right here until that rescue helicopter has picked up Morrison's team and is clear of this valley. Sir, Chen's voice cracked slightly. They're about to lock. I know what they're about to do, Holloway interrupted, but his tone carried no anger, only certainty. And I know what I'm about to do, relay the message. Sir, you can't, Chen started again. Tell them, Holloway continued, and now there was something in his voice that silenced any further argument. It was the voice of a man who had made a decision and accepted all the consequences that came with it. Tell them Slate 12 will provide cover fire until the rescue is complete. Tell them I'm not leaving those men in the valley. Range 20 kilometers, Chen reported, and now his voice was hollow. Lock imminent. 30 seconds until full weapons lock. Holloway banked his A-10 slightly, positioning himself for maximum effectiveness in his final combat engagement. His mind was clear now. There was no doubt. No second-guessing, no fear. There was only the mission and the commitment to see it through. He thought of Bobby Castellano, bloodied and broken in that ravine, being carried to safety by men who understood sacrifice. He thought of Morrison and his team, pushing themselves beyond human limits to bring a fellow pilot home. He thought of the Black Hawk crew, about to fly into the most dangerous moment of their lives, trusting that the A-10 above them would buy them the seconds they needed. He thought of his mother, who'd always worried about his safety. He thought of the letters he'd written and kept in his locker, letters that might never be read. And he pushed those thoughts aside, because they were luxuries he couldn't afford. Slate 12 is locked and loaded, Holloway transmitted, his voice steady and calm and filled with purpose. Morrison, you've got 3 minutes to the extraction zone. Black Hawk, you've got 4 minutes before that SAM battery opens fire. I'm going to buy you those minutes. Do your jobs, get everyone home. Sir, what about you? Morrison's voice crackled through, suddenly urgent. Holloway didn't answer. He was watching his radar scope, watching the SAM system converging on his position, watching the Black Hawk on its southern approach. He was calculating distances and trajectories and impact vectors. He was understanding with absolute clarity what was about to happen. His A-10 screamed toward the converging threat, ready to write its final chapter in blood and fire and sacrifice. "Lock," Chen screamed. "Full weapons lock, they're launching, missile in the air." Holloway saw it simultaneously, the radar spike confirming what his tactical situational awareness had already predicted. A surface-to-air missile had just left its launcher, accelerating from 0 to Mach 3 in less than 3 seconds. The missile's trajectory was perfect. The targeting solution was optimal. The SAM system had locked onto the Black Hawk helicopter, which was now in its final approach vector toward the landing zone where Morrison's team was waiting. The Black Hawk had no chance. Holloway's mind calculated instantly. The missile would cover the distance in approximately 90 seconds. The Black Hawk needed 2 minutes to land, pick up the rescue team, and gain enough altitude to attempt evasive maneuvers. The mathematics were brutal and absolute. The helicopter would be touched down, vulnerable, committed to ground contact when the missile struck. The crew would see the impact coming and be powerless to prevent it. 9 people, 8 pararescue men and 1 rescued pilot who'd already given everything to try to save his damaged aircraft. 9 people who would die in the next 100 seconds unless something changed. Holloway's hands moved on the control stick with absolute precision. He banked hard, his responding to his inputs with the obedience of an extension of his own body. The G-forces pressed him back into his seat, and he used every ounce of his strength to maintain consciousness through the turn. "Sir, what are you doing?" Chen's voice cracked with rising desperation. "Break engagement, initiate evasive maneuvers." Holloway didn't answer. He was too focused on his target, not the SAM launcher but the missile itself. A tiny object moving at supersonic speed through the thin mountain air, invisible except on radar. But Holloway could read the radar, could extrapolate the trajectory, could position himself to intercept. He pushed the throttle to full military power. The A-10's engines, already roaring, screamed to their absolute maximum. The airframe shook with the effort. The aircraft was never designed for maneuvers like this, never built to handle the stresses Holloway was about to impose on it. But she responded, accelerating, climbing, her nose pointed directly at the incoming missile. "Sir," Chen was practically shouting now. "What is your intention, sir? Respond." Holloway keyed the radio. His voice was calm, absolutely impossibly calm. "Black Hawk break approach, initiate climb, get altitude and distance immediately." "Sir, we can provide countermeasures," the Black Hawk pilot responded, her voice tight. "We can." "Negative," Holloway interrupted. "You cannot, but I can break approach, now." In the Black Hawk's cabin, Captain Hammer Hendricks understood what Holloway was saying, understood what he was planning to do. She'd heard the tone before, not in Holloway's voice, but in other pilots' voices, in training videos, in the historical records of aviators who'd made similar decisions. It was the tone of a man who had accepted his fate. "Black Hawk breaking approach," she transmitted, her voice hollow, "climbing to altitude." The Black Hawk pilot yanked back on the control stick, the helicopter's nose rising as it poured on power. But the missile was already committed, its guidance system locked onto the aircraft's radar signature. The missile banked to follow, its trajectory adjusting in real time. Holloway was already there. His A-10 cut directly into the missile's path, positioning itself between the incoming warhead and the Black Hawk. For one crystalline moment, Holloway could actually see the missile, a white streak of smoke and fury, growing larger in his canopy, the small fins visible as it tracked toward him with absolute precision. "Tell my family I love them," Holloway said into the radio, his voice steady and clear. "Tell them I did my job." Chen understood. In that instant, Kyle Chen understood absolutely what was about to happen. His weapons officer's mind screamed in protest, but there was nothing he could do. Nothing anyone could do. The missile was seconds away. "Sir, no," Chen started to transmit, but the words died in his throat. The missile struck the A-10's fuselage directly amidships, at the junction of the wing and the main body. For an instant, just an infinitesimal fraction of a second, there was a moment of crystalline clarity. The warhead penetrated the titanium armor that had protected Holloway through 17 years of combat flying. It detonated with the force of several hundred pounds of high explosives. The A-10 Warthog, that magnificent flying tank, that aircraft that was supposed to be nearly unsinkable, simply came apart. The explosion was visible from the ground, a massive orange fireball blooming against the gray sky, brilliant against the afternoon clouds. From Morrison's position in the ravine, the light was so intense it was almost spiritual in nature. Silence fell over the entire valley for just a moment, as if the mountains themselves had taken a breath and held it. Then the sound reached them, a deep, resonant boom that echoed off the surrounding peaks and seemed to shake the very earth beneath their feet. "Slate 12, Morrison transmitted, his voice barely audible. "Slate 12, respond." Nothing, only the wind, only the echo of that explosion fading into the distance. "Slate 12, come in," Morrison tried again, his voice rising in pitch. "Ghost, respond, come in, Slate 12. The radio remained silent. In the Black Hawk, Captain Hendricks had instinctively turned to look back, and she saw the explosion. She understood what had just happened. Behind her, the crew chief had seen it too. Their savior, the armored angel that had been protecting them, that had been buying them time with cannon fire and willpower and absolute commitment, had just paid the ultimate price. "All stations, the missile is neutralized," Hendricks transmitted, her voice carrying the weight of understanding. Slate 12 has taken the shot." On the ground, Morrison stood frozen. Major Castellano, despite his injuries and his semi-conscious state, felt the sudden change in the air. Something fundamental had shifted. Something irreplaceable had been sacrificed. Chen sat alone in the weapons officer's seat, staring at a radar scope that was no longer tracking his pilot's aircraft. The blip that represented Captain James Holloway was simply gone. 18 months of flying together, 847 hours of shared missions, all reduced to absence. The silence on the radio was deafening. "Black Hawk, you are clear to execute extraction," Command's voice came through, sounding distant and hollow. "Sam's system is destroyed. You have no missile threats in the immediate area. Extract the rescue team." "Copy that," Hendricks responded, and her hands moved automatically to adjust her approach vector. The southern approach to the extraction zone was now clear. The enemy had been shocked by the sacrifice, momentarily stunned by the destruction of both the SAM launcher and the A-10 that had saved them. She descended toward the landing zone where Morrison's team waited, where they were carrying a wounded pilot who had been saved by a fellow pilot's willingness to give everything. In that moment there was no victory, no triumph, no satisfaction. There was only loss, profound, absolute loss. An entire human being, a man with a mother and father, with friends and fellow pilots, with dreams and hopes and a future that would never be realized, had chosen to end himself so that others could live. The A-10 wreckage burned on the mountainside, a funeral pyre for Captain James "Ghost" Holloway, whose final act would echo through the ranks of military aviators for generations to come. In the sky above the Hindu Kush, a hero had made his last flight, and in doing so, he had given 9 people a chance to go home alive. The Black Hawk touched down so hard that every soul inside felt the impact. Captain Hammer Hendricks had been flying at the absolute limits of safety, pushing the helicopter to the edge of its performance envelope, and now she was committing it to ground contact with a desperation that bordered on reckless. But there was no time for gentle approaches, no room for textbook procedures. A man was dead in the sky. 9 people were still on the ground. The extraction window was measured in seconds. "Coming in hot," the crew chief screamed, his voice barely audible over the rotor noise. "Taking fire from the west, multiple positions." Morrison's team didn't wait for the aircraft to fully settle. They were already moving, carrying Castellano on the makeshift litter toward the open ramp. Big Dog Washington was laying down, suppressing fire from his position, his M4 barking in controlled bursts toward the western ridge. Kid Reynolds had shifted position to cover the northern approach, and Freight Train Novak was maintaining 360-degree security awareness. The enemy, shocked by the destruction of their SAM battery and the disappearance of the A-10, had recovered quickly. They understood now that the primary threat was gone. They understood that air support was no longer a factor. Now it was just ground combat, rifle versus rifle, determination versus determination. But Morrison's team was better trained, better led, and right now they had momentum. "Move, move, move," Morrison roared, and his men responded with the kind of speed that only elite soldiers could achieve. Each member of the team had trained for this exact scenario hundreds of times. Extract a wounded casualty while under fire, load into a helicopter under fire, escape before the enemy could organize an effective counterattack. Doc Yamamoto, still nursing his shoulder wound but functioning at full combat capacity, practically threw Castellano up the helicopter ramp. Torres was right there, securing the stretcher to the floor attachment points with practiced efficiency. The aircraft's medical systems came to life, IV lines already prepared, oxygen already flowing into Castellano's nostrils. "Got him secured," Torres transmitted over the internal intercom. "Get us out of here." "Copy that." Hendricks didn't need to be told twice. She'd been watching the clock since the missile impact, watching the seconds tick away, waiting for the moment when enough of her people were aboard that she could lift off without leaving anyone behind. Novak was the last man up the ramp, taking a round in the left shoulder as he bounded toward the helicopter. He stumbled, recovered, and threw himself onto the cargo deck. The crew chief, Sullivan, immediately grabbed him and hauled him fully inside, away from the door guns firing lanes. "Clear," Sullivan screamed. Hendricks pulled up on the collective, and the Black Hawk surged upward with desperate power. The rotor blades bit the thin mountain air, fighting against gravity and inertia and the desperate desire to escape this valley of death. Rounds punched through the fuselage, not armor-piercing ammunition, just standard rifle fire, but each impact was a reminder of how vulnerable they were in those critical seconds of liftoff. A crew member named Jackson, manning the starboard door gun, opened fire at the enemy positions. The machine gun's distinctive roar echoed through the interior of the helicopter. Around him, Morrison's men were checking weapons, assessing injuries, performing immediate casualty care on the two newly wounded, Yamamoto and Novak, while simultaneously providing their own suppressing fire against the enemy. "Altitude 200 feet and climbing," the co-pilot reported, "coming up on departure vector." The Black Hawk banked hard, and suddenly Morrison could see the crash site from his vantage point in the cargo bay. He could see the wreckage of the fighter jet, still burning, and somewhere beyond it, beyond the ridge, was the wreckage of the A-10. The funeral pyre of Captain James Holloway. Morrison's hands, which had been busy securing equipment and organizing his team, suddenly stilled. The reality of what had just happened, what he'd witnessed, struck him with the force of a physical blow. A man he'd never met, a man whose name he'd only known for a few hours, had sacrificed everything so that his team could complete their mission. "Slate 12 is gone," Morrison said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The others heard him anyway. The cargo bay fell silent except for the roar of the rotor blades and the wind rushing past the open doors. "He knew," Big Dog Washington said, his massive frame somehow smaller now, his voice hollow. "He knew the whole time. He made his choice." Major Castellano, semi-conscious on the stretcher, managed to open his eyes. The morphine Torres had injected was working, dulling the pain but not consciousness. Castellano's lips moved, trying to form words. "Ghost," Castellano whispered. "Where's Ghost?" No one answered. There was no good answer to that question. There was only the terrible truth. A man who'd been a stranger a few hours ago had died so that Castellano could live. "Altitude 500 feet and climbing," the co-pilot reported. "We're clear of immediate fire zones. Continuing departure." Hendricks maintained a steep climb angle, trading speed for altitude, wanting to get as much vertical separation as possible between her aircraft and any remaining enemy positions. Her hands moved automatically on the controls, muscle memory and training overriding the emotional weight of what had just happened in that mountain valley. Behind her in the cargo bay, Morrison was already beginning the process of compartmentalizing his emotions. It was a skill that soldiers developed through necessity. You grieved later. Right now, your job was to ensure that those who were alive remained alive. Your job was to honor the sacrifice by completing the mission. "Medical status," Morrison called out. "Report." "Castellano is stable," Torres responded, his medic's focus crystal clear despite the chaos. "Wounds are manageable. He'll make it." "Yamamoto." "Shoulder entry and exit wound. Painful but not life-threatening. I'm getting the bleeding under control." "Novik." "Same story, shoulder impact. Conscious and functioning, he'll be fine." Morrison nodded. They'd taken casualties, but they were all going to survive. All of them, because of what Holloway had done. The Black Hawk continued its climb, moving away from the mountains, moving towards safer airspace. In the distance, Morrison could see the forward operating base where they'd launched from, solid ground, American presence, safety. 2 minutes to friendly territory, the co-pilot announced. 2 minutes. In just 120 seconds, they would cross from contested airspace into the relative safety of American-controlled territory. The enemy couldn't follow them there. Their threat had been neutralized. Captain Hendricks allowed herself one moment of weakness. Her hands trembled slightly on the control stick and her eyes went watery. She blinked hard, refusing to let tears fall while she was still commanding an aircraft. That would come later. For now, she had a job to do. "Black Hawk en route to FOB Salerno," she transmitted. 9 souls on board, 1 priority casualty, 2 secondary casualties with gunshot wounds. Estimated arrival time 8 minutes. "Copy that, Black Hawk," command responded. "Medical teams are standing by. Welcome home." Welcome home. The words felt hollow. One man wasn't coming home. One man was burning in the wreckage of an A-10 on a mountainside in the Hindu Kush, his final flight now complete. Morrison looked back at Major Castellano, the man they'd come to save. Castellano's eyes were glazed from the morphine, barely focused, but they were open. He was alive. He would go home to his wife. He would see his daughter again. And he would carry for the rest of his life the knowledge that a stranger had given everything so that he could have that opportunity. The Black Hawk pushed forward through the mountain passes, carrying its burden of rescued and wounded, leaving behind the body of the man who'd made it all possible. The rotor blades beat their steady rhythm, the heartbeat of escape, the sound of survival, the echo of sacrifice. Behind them, Slate 12 would fly no more. The weather window closed at 600 hours the next morning. 72 hours after Captain James Holloway had driven his A-10 directly into an incoming surface-to-air missile, conditions finally stabilized enough for a recovery operation. The Hindu Kush Mountains had kept their secret for 3 days, the wreckage hidden by clouds and snow flurries, and the constant wind that seemed to guard the peaks like a jealous sentinel. Colonel Marcus Webb, commander of the 355th Fighter Squadron, stood in the mission briefing room at Bagram Airfield and looked at the faces of the pilots assembled before him. Most of them had known Holloway. Some had flown with him. All of them understood what his sacrifice meant. "This isn't a combat rescue," Webb said, his voice steady but heavy. "This is a recovery mission. We're bringing one of our own home. I want to be clear about something. We do not leave our people behind, ever. Not living, not dead." Captain Holloway understood that principle. He lived it. He died for it. We're going to honor that by bringing him back with the same commitment he showed for others. The special operations teams gathered in an adjacent briefing room were equally solemn. Master Sergeant Daniel Morrison had volunteered immediately to be part of the recovery team. Command had initially refused. Morrison was exhausted, emotionally drained, still processing what had happened. But Morrison had been insistent. "Ghost bought us the time," Morrison had said simply. "The least I can do is bring him home." They'd granted his request. The recovery helicopter lifted off at dawn, escorted by 2 F-16 fighters and an AC-130 gunship. No chances were being taken. The enemy understood the value of preventing the recovery of an American pilot's remains. They would attempt to interfere, to deny closure to the fallen's family, to prevent the military from completing its sacred obligation. But they wouldn't succeed. The wreckage was exactly where the satellite imagery indicated it would be. The A-10 had come apart on impact, strewing debris across 200 meters of terrain. The main fuselage, where the titanium cockpit armor sat, was the most heavily concentrated section. It was also the most difficult to approach, perched on the edge of a ravine, accessible only through treacherous terrain. Morrison moved across that terrain with a team of 6 specialists, combat recovery personnel trained in the grim work of recovering human remains from aircraft wreckage. The AC-130 gunship orbited overhead, watching for enemy movement. The F-16s carved patterns through the sky above, maintaining air superiority. But it was quiet. The enemy seemed to have moved on, or perhaps they understood that some debts were sacred and shouldn't be disturbed. The cockpit section was relatively intact. Morrison's hands were steady as he approached it, though his heart was anything but steady. Inside that titanium shell was Captain James Holloway, or what remained of him. The forensic team worked with meticulous care. Holloway had been an exceptional pilot, and his remains would be treated with the same respect and professionalism he would have shown for a fallen brother. Every piece of debris was carefully collected. Every item was documented. Every action was performed with the reverence due to a fallen warrior. When they finally extracted Holloway's remains from the wreckage, Morrison found himself weeping openly. The tough master sergeant, the decorated pararescueman, the elite soldier who'd stared death in the face dozens of times, stood in a mountain ravine and wept for a man he'd known for only a few hours but understood completely. Holloway's flight suit still bore his name tape. His call sign Ghost was stitched in letters below it. His wedding ring, they'd had to cut it off with specially designed tools, was recovered separately. His watch had stopped at the exact moment of impact, 14:47 hours. The same time Morrison's team had found Major Castellano alive in that other wreckage, just kilometers away. The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone. Back at Bagram Airfield, the impact of Holloway's sacrifice was spreading through the pilot community like ripples on a pond. Holloway's wingman, Captain Marcus Viper Chen, sat in a quiet corner of the flight operations building and stared at nothing. He'd been Holloway's weapons officer, had been in contact with the pilot throughout that final engagement. Chen had heard Holloway's calm voice, had understood what the pilot was doing, had been powerless to prevent it. Now Chen found himself replaying the mission over and over in his head, analyzing every decision, every second, wondering if there had been something he could have done differently, wondering if there was something he'd missed that could have changed the outcome. But the analysts had already reached their conclusions. Command had already released the preliminary investigation findings. Holloway's decision was classified as a deliberate act of tactical brilliance combined with self-sacrifice. The reports used words like heroic, exceptional, extraordinary. They were beginning to build the narrative of a hero. Chen wasn't interested in narratives. He was interested in the fact that his pilot was dead. The memorial service at Luke Air Force Base, Holloway's home station, was standing room only. Every pilot from the squadron showed up. Pilots from other squadrons came too. Mechanics, crew chiefs, administrative personnel. The entire extended family of Holloway's Air Force career turned out to honor him. Holloway's mother, Margaret, sat in the front row with her husband. She'd been informed of her son's death through official military channels, but nothing could truly prepare a parent for the reality of it. Margaret held her husband's hand throughout the service, and when they played the final recording of Holloway's calm voice during that last transmission, "Tell my family I love them. Tell them I did my job," she collapsed into tears. The Air Force Chief of Staff gave the eulogy, speaking of Holloway's 17 years of service, his 247 combat missions, his consistent professionalism and dedication. But what he emphasized, what he kept returning to, was the moment of choice. The moment when Captain James Holloway had been given an option and chosen sacrifice instead of self-preservation. That decision, the Chief of Staff said, defines the very best of what it means to be a military officer. Not just the flying, not just the technical expertise, not just the years of service, but the willingness, when the moment demands it, to give everything for those who depend on you. At forward operating bases across Afghanistan, pilots began touching a small patch that had been designed to commemorate Holloway. It became a ritual, a small gesture of respect and a request for luck. The patch showed Holloway's A-10 silhouetted against a rising sun, with his call sign, Ghost, beneath it. Holloway's apartment back in the States was carefully cataloged by military personnel. There were photographs, Holloway with his parents, Holloway receiving flying certificates, Holloway at an air show standing in front of an A-10. There were letters addressed to his parents, written and left in a locked drawer, letters to be opened in case of his death. In them, Holloway discussed his love for flying, his pride in his service, his understanding that this career carried certain risks. He had accepted those risks, he had understood the cost, and in the end he had paid it willingly. The official investigation concluded that Captain James Holloway had demonstrated exceptional tactical awareness, superior airmanship, and extraordinary courage under extreme duress. His actions had directly resulted in the survival of 9 military personnel who would otherwise have been killed or captured. The report recommended him for the Medal of Honor. But for Morrison, for Chen, for the Black Hawk crew, for Castellano lying in a hospital bed recovering from his wounds, the medal seemed almost meaningless. They would have traded every medal, every commendation, every official recognition, just to have Holloway walk back into the pilot-ready room and complain about the weather. That wasn't going to happen. Instead, what would happen was that his legacy would grow. His sacrifice would be studied in command schools and officer training programs. His decision would be analyzed and discussed, and held up as an example of the highest principles of military service. New pilots would hear his story and understand what it truly meant to never leave a comrade behind. Slate 12 would fly no more, but the memory of Captain James Holloway would soar eternally through the ranks of those who understood sacrifice. The East Room of the White House was filled with the kind of solemn dignity reserved for the highest honors the nation could bestow. Margaret Holloway sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes fixed on the podium where the president stood. Beside her was her husband, Robert, his weathered face stoic but his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Behind them sat representatives from every major military branch, Congressional Medal of Honor recipients from previous decades, and the cream of the nation's military leadership. The citation being read aloud was a document that had been carefully crafted over months by historians, military strategists, and Pentagon officials. Every word had been chosen for precision and power. Every phrase carried weight. Captain James Holloway demonstrated extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty during combat operations on September 15, 2021, in the Hindu Kush Mountains of Afghanistan. With complete disregard for his own safety, and with full knowledge of the consequences of his actions, Captain Holloway positioned his aircraft directly between an incoming air defense missile and a rescue helicopter containing 8 military personnel and 1 wounded comrade. By deliberately sacrificing his own life, Captain Holloway ensured the survival of 9 American military members who would otherwise certainly have perished. His actions exemplify the highest principles of military service and demonstrate the profound commitment of those who volunteer to protect this nation. When the President placed the Medal of Honor around Margaret Holloway's neck, there was not a dry eye in the room. Margaret held the medal in her trembling hands, and for the first time since receiving news of her son's death, she allowed herself to break down completely. Her husband held her, and the 2 grieving parents wept for the son they'd raised, the man he'd become, and the choice he'd made. In a hospital room in Germany, Major Robert Castellano watched the Medal of Honor ceremony on a television mounted on the wall. His left leg was in traction, his chest wrapped in compression bandages, but his eyes were focused completely on the screen. When the President read the citation, Castellano's hands clenched into fists. He understood with absolute clarity that every breath he took, every word he spoke, every day he would live for the rest of his life was a gift purchased by Captain James Holloway's sacrifice. Castellano had made a decision during his recovery. When he returned to flight status, and his doctors assured him he would volunteer for command positions where he could influence how the next generation of pilots understood sacrifice and service. He would carry Holloway's legacy forward. It was the least he could do. At Luke Air Force Base, the dedication ceremony for the Holloway Memorial was held on a clear October morning. The statue depicted an A-10 in profile, nose slightly elevated as if climbing toward the sun. Below it, a plaque bore Holloway's name, his dates of service, his call sign, and a single line of text: "He gave everything so others could live." The statue's placement was strategic, directly on the flight line, visible from every pilot's route to the Flight Operations Building. Every pilot who departed on a combat mission would see it. Every pilot who returned would pass it. And many of them, following a tradition that had begun spontaneously and been formalized by command, would touch it gently and whisper a prayer or a promise. Captain Marcus "Viper" Chen was among the first to touch the statue. He ran his fingers across Holloway's name and allowed himself, finally, to feel something other than guilt. He felt pride in having flown with such a man, pride in the example Holloway had set, and gratitude, profound gratitude, that he'd been chosen to be Holloway's weapons officer during that final, glorious mission. Chen had decided not to resign from the military. Instead, he would stay. He would fly. He would teach the next generation of weapons officers about tactical thinking and about what it meant to support pilots who were willing to sacrifice everything. In his own way, Chen would keep Holloway's memory alive. Captain Sarah "Hammer" Hendricks faced a different journey. She'd returned to the Black Hawk piloting with a new perspective. She understood now that her job wasn't just to fly a helicopter. It was to carry hopes and dreams and futures. Every mission mattered because someone's child, someone's parent, someone's spouse might be depending on her decisions. She'd established a memorial scholarship in Holloway's name for the families of fallen aviators, an enduring monument to his sacrifice funded by her own dedication to excellence. Master Sergeant Daniel "Dutch" Morrison continued leading pararescue teams, and his leadership philosophy shifted subtly but significantly. He carried with him the understanding that sometimes you're called upon to step into the gap, to be the person who makes the hard choice. Morrison instituted new training protocols emphasizing the relationship between air assets and ground teams, teaching the next generation of pararescue men that the pilots above them weren't distant observers. They were partners willing to give their lives. The documentary team from PBS had approached the Department of Defense about creating a documentary film about the mission. After careful deliberation, the Pentagon approved it. The film, titled Slate 12, The Last Flight, premiered at Sundance Film Festival and went on to win multiple awards. More importantly, it introduced millions of Americans to the story of Captain James Holloway and what his sacrifice had meant. At military academies across the country, Holloway's decision became a teaching point. Senior leaders discussing command and leadership decisions, junior officers learning about ethical frameworks and professional responsibility, all of them encountered Holloway's story. It became a parable, a touchstone, a reference point for conversations about what it truly meant to serve. The Air Force established the Holloway Award for Exceptional Close Air Support, given annually to the pilot who demonstrated the highest standards of professionalism, tactical excellence, and commitment to ground forces. The award included a substantial monetary component, but more importantly, it carried prestige within the pilot community. To receive the Holloway Award meant that your fellow pilots, the harshest judges of all, considered you worthy of standing in that legacy. Holloway's apartment was converted into a small museum managed by the Air Force History Center. Visitors could see his personal effects, read the letters he'd written to his parents, view photographs of his life. School groups came through on field trips. Young people who'd never known him learned about him. Potential military recruits stood in that quiet room and contemplated what service meant. Major Castellano recovered from his wounds more completely than his doctors had predicted. Months later, he stood on a runway and looked at an F-16 fighter jet, preparing for his first flight since the crash. As he climbed the ladder to the cockpit, he touched the fuselage and whispered, "Thanks, Ghost." In the Pentagon, high-level strategic discussions about air defense systems and SAM threats were forever changed by understanding the specific capabilities Holloway's sacrifice had revealed. His final engagement had demonstrated gaps in their defensive concepts that led to significant tactical and technological changes. Holloway's death had made the military stronger. Years later, a young pilot named Lieutenant Sarah Chen, no relation to Viper, sat in an advanced leadership course at the Naval Academy. Her instructor was discussing decision-making under pressure when he pulled up Captain Holloway's Medal of Honor citation. Sarah Chen had chosen to be a pilot partly because of stories she'd read about Slate 12. Her father had been career military. Her grandmother had told her about the A-10 pilot who'd saved 9 people by giving his own life. What was running through his mind? A cadet asked. How did he make that decision? The instructor smiled sadly. I don't think it was complicated for him. He understood that the people below him, the people depending on him, were more important than his own survival. That understanding wasn't unique to Holloway, but his willingness to act on it completely and without hesitation. That's what made him extraordinary. On the mountainside in Afghanistan where Slate 12 had come to rest, the wreckage had long since been scattered by weather and scavengers. But if someone had looked carefully, they might have found small tributes left by soldiers and pilots passing through. A photograph, a letter, a metal ribbon. Holloway's grave was marked not by a headstone, but by the memory of every person he'd saved and every person they would save in turn. Captain James Holloway had lived to fly. He had died so that others could live. And in death, he had become immortal, not as a legend or a myth, but as a living principle embedded in the hearts and minds of those who chose to serve. The A-10 call sign Ghost would never be assigned to another pilot, and every time a new pilot received their wings, when they looked at the list of honored fallen, they would see his name, Captain James Holloway, Slate 12. The man who proved that the ultimate measure of a life isn't how long you live, but what you're willing to give for others. In the sky above the Hindu Kush, in the hearts of the soldiers he saved, in the policies that were changed because of his sacrifice, in the young pilots inspired by his story, Captain James Holloway flew on, eternal and immortal, a testament to the power of human courage and the transformative nature of genuine sacrifice. Slate 12 had completed his final mission, and 9 people who would never otherwise have gone home lived to tell his story.